Hi, this is Len Edgerly. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, episode 716 for Friday, February 23rd. In this episode, I want to share an interview that I did on Thursday, February 8th with Matt Gallagher, whose new novel Daybreak was released February 20th by Simon & Schuster. I think the interview will explain what the novel is about. I thought it was a very powerful story, and the fact that it was set in the midst of a war that is still going made it really helpful to me in understanding from a human level what the stakes are in Ukraine. So with that, here is my conversation with Matt Gallagher. Hi, Matt.
Len, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing fine. Let me rename myself so it's not my wife.
Yeah, I figured you might be sharing her account.
Yes. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you about this book, a powerful book. Enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So let's see, yeah, make sure I'm recording. I did hit the button. Yes. Um, so your novel's going to be out in 12 days from Simon and Schuster. I, what are those 12 days like leading up to the book? Are you sleeping well, or what kind of emotions go through you this close to your next book coming out?
This is my fourth book, third novel, so they're all different. I maybe I know just enough now to get myself in trouble. But so I'm keeping myself occupied. The subject matter is the Ukraine war, so I've been working on some op-eds and some essays
Hmm.
uh, related to the upcoming anniversary. Uh, so that's a good way to not dwell on things well outside of my control, such as reviews and how it'll be received by the literary part of the world, which sometimes has a mixed relationship to literature, kind of taken from current events.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and also helps. I have two young kids, so
Oh, good.
I can't get into my own head too much. They need to be taken to school and picked up from swim practice and all the rest.
How old are they?
6 and 3,
Yeah, yeah.
so a lot of
That's
lot of activity.
a powerful source of sanity in your life right there.
Indeed, indeed.
Well, let's talk about the story. What's the story behind your novel here? What's it about?
So Daybreak takes place in February 2022, right as Russia's invading Ukraine, uh, and it follows a pair of U.S. military veterans who served in Afghanistan into the country. They're going the opposite way of most people who, Ukrainian women and children who are trying to escape the country. One, Han Lee, is going to join the fight. He's heeding President Zelensky's call that was put out for uh, military veterans who wanted to fight in support of a democracy under attack. The other is our main character, Luke Paxton. He's going for kind of more muddled reasons. Like Han, he's kind of lost in life, in civilian life back in the States, doesn't really kind of never got going after his time in uniform. He's also very kind of tormented by a memory of a Ukrainian woman he once knew and loved, named Svetlana Dovebush. And as he's been watching the news, like we all were during those weeks and days, seeing Ukraine under attack, he decides to join Han and try to track this woman down, who he hasn't seen or heard from for 10 years now.
Hmm. I wasn't clear. Can anybody just go and offer to help the Ukrainians? I mean, we don't have any official military presence there. How tricky is it for someone to do what Han and Luke did?
Especially then, not tricky at all. I
Hmm.
myself went there during those weeks as a volunteer alongside some other American military veterans. We went to just kind of train civilians and kind of basic self-defense if they needed it. But we rode those same buses, rode those same trains as a lot of the international, what would end up becoming the International Legion. British men, Australian men, American men, Canadian men, women too, but mostly men, who had served often in the Middle East and found that experience unfulfilling for a variety of reasons, and decided that Ukraine was it. That was it was something they wanted to participate in. Some of that oftentimes is very noble, right? To be willing to die and fight for an idea and an ideal is a tremendous thing. A lot of times, though, it's complicated. These are lost souls. It's not a normal thing to do to be able to take off and leave at the drop of a hat. Whatever life you have from wherever you're coming from, and that kind of ambiguity and murkiness really interested me, both as a person when I was talking to these people when I was over there, and also as a writer, because I don't know, the murky grays of existence. That's where those are the books I like to read about, and I like to write about as well. So the story just kind of came from there.
Hmm. Why do you think you're drawn to those kinds of stories that have the murkiness to them?
It's a good question, Len. I don't know. The epigraph for this book comes from Lord Jim, by Conrad. I was well aware that I was kind of writing in an older tradition of Conrad, of Hemingway, Graham Greene, maybe even a little Orwell. And as much as those authors' books meant to me and in some ways shaped my life, the world has changed tremendously.
Hmm.
America's role has changed tremendously. There's a earned skepticism. We saw it over there as volunteers, and in my subsequent trips as a journalist. There's skepticism towards America and our involvement, and we've earned that. At the same time, um, this war needs to be fought, right?
Hmm.
Certainly from the Ukrainian perspective of survival and self-determination. So I don't know why I'm drawn to it. I don't know. I do know that I think more clearly about these big issues um, when I sit down and write about it, and
Hmm.
the fogginess of it all in my head dissipates and clears up as it forms into a story that I hope and believe readers will find engaging.
Now, this book, as well as your previous novel, Youngblood, it's a love story, it's a war story, and I think there was a love interest also in Youngblood. What I guess there's a lot of war stories that have love in them, but what's the relationship? It seems like it's sort of diametrically opposed. I mean, war is this awful thing, and love is one of the best things humans can do. What brings them together in a story so meaningfully?
uh, the highs and lows of the human experience. I think the formative experience of my life was being a young lieutenant in Iraq, um, fighting a misguided war, in my opinion, uh, and interacting a lot more than I'd trained or expected with Iraqi civilians. Right, people who just happened to, for geographical lottery, geographical bad luck, were living amongst a war zone, and I found it fascinating, the layers of their experience. I was there 15 months, which is a long time, but that's a drop in the bucket to the decade plus of war these people were just trying to survive. Right? I mean, less than 1% of Iraqis that we encountered were insurgents, or people trying to attack us, or attack other Iraqis. 99.5% of them were just trying to live and get by. And I saw similar in Ukraine, right? The folks we trained with, we worked with, by and large, weren't going to join the military, but they were going to pick up a gun if the Russians reached Lviv and
Hmm.
fight to protect their neighborhood, fight to protect their families. Um, Watching, I don't know, there's something beautiful and so sad about normal society trying to hold itself together in the midst of so much ruin. It's it's something that I just uh, as a person I'm just fascinated by. I find it motivating and uh, terrifying at the same time. But then of course as a writer, it's so rich. There's so much
Hmm.
there to draw from, and I'm well aware that I'm writing for Americans, and for us, we have a strange relationship to war, because war is always something, at least since 1865, we can go go to if we want, or avoid if we want. It's never here, right? It's never
Hmm.
in our backyards. And I don't know. As a literary writer, I almost sometimes view part of my job as being a cultural translator, to try to convey what the everyday human experience of that, my first book of Iraqis, and in the case of this book of Ukrainians, is like, what that's like for Americans who have never had to confront through, thank God for that, but through a lot of luck, and just by the nature of having been born here, never having to confront some of these hard decisions that these people make every single day.
Yeah, I think one of the most jarring details, I can't remember if it's Svetlana, but there was somebody taking their boys to a swimming lesson. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is the war in Ukraine. There are no swimming lessons. There's just Russians and Zelensky and all of the stuff that you see filtered through the news. But something that simple takes on more impact when you realize that it is happening in the midst of a war and they don't know when the missiles are going to come. And I suspect those are the kinds of things as a writer that you can put in front of a reader that really makes them just sit up and say, wow, this is something I know nothing about.
That's exactly right, and your memory is correct. That is Svetlana, and Luke's reaction is kind of similar to yours, which is, "What do you mean you're going to swim, going to a swim lesson?" But oftentimes, the most courageous thing people can do in these situations is to go about everyday life, is to try to stoically ignore as best they can the change to their life patterns, oftentimes putting themselves at great personal risk because of it. But again, these are choices that Ukrainians were having to make back in 2022 and have had to make every day and every evening since.
Yeah.
Whether it's going to school, whether it's going to swim lessons, whether it's going to work, and I'm not a retired general, so I can't go on CNN and talk about the geopolitical machinations or the great gains being made in a counteroffensive. But I think I am pretty good at kind of tapping into the human experience. And I don't know, once this story started forming after we got back from our first trip to Ukraine, it just kind of tumbled out of me. And I assure you that has not been my experience with my previous books.
Hmm.
I've had to kind of wrestle those ones out of me. Whereas this one, for whatever reason, maybe the urgency aspect of it was a big role. It came out clean and it came out smooth.
How did the character of Svetlana arrive for you? What were sort of the genesis of who she is and what she brings to the story?
So yeah, Svetlana is an important character because in many ways, Luke Paxton, her former love, has never kind of moved on. Like he's stuck in 2012 with what happened between them. In They'd spent some time together in Italy, where he was stationed with the army, and then he's stuck in 2012 because of a very serious combat incident that occurred in Afghanistan. He has pretty severe PTSD, and that's kind of a recurring thing I've seen, not just from combat veterans who suffer from it, but from if you're in a traumatic car accident and you have PTSD, right? Kind of being stuck in that moment is something people describe recurringly. Svetlana's moved on. She's lived a whole life. She has a son. She has a marriage. She has a life in Lviv that is now kind of similarly to the way war jarred Luke Paxton's life 10 years before in Afghanistan. The war is now putting her life 10 years later on pause.
Hmm.
And she's having to navigate all these conundrums, all these hard decisions of whether to stay in the country with her son so he can maintain a relationship with his father, or whether they should join the refugees fleeing to Poland or Germany. Because while they are in relative safety in Lviv in Western Ukraine, the city is getting struck by cruise missiles.
Hmm.
And I don't want to give too much away, but
Mm-hmm.
cruise missiles do play a role in the book's plot.
Hmm.
And more than anything, I think I wanted Svetlana to be kind of a fully dimensional, dynamic character who readers get to know so they can better understand the Ukrainian perspective and get to better understand those impossible decisions they're all facing day to day, and put themselves in her shoes, and maybe they would make a different choice, and that's totally fine. But if they understand what she's wrestling with, what she's grappling with, all the while having a former lover from 10 years before showing up literally at her door, saying, "I'm here to help." I hope they find that interesting, because I had a real interesting time writing her.
Yeah, there's a lot of drama there, but he has a nickname. He called her Gypsy, and she lets him know that's not a good thing to call her now that
Right.
she's back in Ukraine.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was once a flirtatious nickname for them in their early 20s, when they were, partying together and enjoying life together. Doesn't land quite the same way now that she's a serious grown mother
Mm.
back in her home country.
I think that now Youngblood was set during the Iraq War, came out in 2016, and I think the war had ended, or at least the U.S. involvement ended like 5 years before that. So there was a little bit of, you could look back on the Iraq War as you were writing that book and publishing it. How much more of a challenge was it to write the story of this war before it's even over, before we have any clue how it's going to end?
Yeah, no, that's a real good question. It was a very different experience in that regard. I wanted Youngblood to have kind of a reflective nature, looking back on the whole thing. Much of the plot is, even within the book, is kind of taking in the trajectory of that war and its legacy and ramifications. This is different. There was an article, I think, in about 4 or 5 weeks ago now, in the New York Review of Books by Nathaniel Rich, that it was writing about World War II literature,
Hmm.
and the punctual literature was the term they used. Literature that was being
Punctual? What did that mean? Punctual?
it was literature about set in the war, at least, if not about the war, that was being written during it.
Oh, I see.
So
Hmm.
unknowingly, I was kind of doing something similar, um, and it just has a kind of a different urgency to it, right? Uh, I knew the whole time when I was writing this that I couldn't make any kind of grand proclamations about how the war was going to turn out. That having kind of a very small, tight window with a bit of an open ending, to what is going to follow, uh, was the only intellectually honest thing I could do. Uh, Almost paradoxically, though, I kind of found that liberating,
Hmm.
because I didn't have to make, I don't know, any kind of large commentary. I felt the pressure with Youngblood of being an Iraq veteran, having my having my say about what it all meant or didn't mean, etc. This is just kind of a different book with a different message. It's more about, I think, everyday courage, both physical courage and moral courage, and I think there's something universal about that, that doesn't necessarily need a neat, tidy ending that a treaty would provide.
Yeah. Yeah, you can sort of enter it more as a writer than as a, well, you're not a general pundit, but you could have been a pundit yourself just because of your own experience in Iraq, and a little more freedom to enter it as a writer.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Hmm. Um, there was an interesting comment you made in an interview I watched about how Senator John McCain had gotten in some hot water by saying that he thought that Iraq and Afghanistan were going to be generational conflicts, 30 years,
Mhm.
get ready for it, which I agreed when you said this, at least he was honest about it. Do you think the Ukraine war is looking to be a generational war? Uh, if not for the U.S., for Ukraine, that it just goes on and on?
Certainly, most Ukrainians I've spoken with consider it one.
Hmm.
That they believe wholeheartedly that Russia wants to conquer the vast majority of their territory. Putin has very openly said that he does not believe Ukraine should be a state and is not a separate people. Uh, what's fascinating about that is, because of this war, he's probably made more Russian-speaking Ukrainians more patriotic for Ukraine than ever existed before. Visiting some of those villages and towns that have been occupied by Russian troops, you see that tremendously in interviewing people. People
Did
that
you get to some of those places when you were there?
we yes, in not that first trip, but second and third trip, I went back as a journalist.
Hmm.
I interviewed a 76-year-old woman who's spoken Russian her whole life, that is now teaching herself Ukrainian because it's the only way she can think of to honor her grandson who was killed fighting
Wow.
Russians.
Wow.
And that's just one anecdote, but there's a lot that's happening kind of across the country, or at least
Hmm.
across the eastern part of the country. So I understand kind of Westerners' impulse for a treaty. We want this to end. We want this to get off our news, and that may happen with some territorial concessions. but I don't think that's going to end the war. It may put it on pause. It may put it on hiatus. But a Ukrainian army officer I respect tremendously that I've gotten to know over there thinks that if and when that occurs, both sides will just keep building, preparing for the next iteration,
Wow.
the next phase. So, again, America's relationship to these conflicts is just so different. Like I think we have a hard time kind of grappling the history and the the war for identity that is baked into this, and has been going on for hundreds of years. Um, but unfortunately, I hate to give a dark, cynical answer, but no, I think this is a generational war for Ukrainians,
Mm.
and we as Americans have to decide, and we're in the process of doing that now with our Congress, uh, how involved we want to continue to engage with that. I understand the appeal of isolation. I understand the appeal of withdrawing from the world. At the same time, history shows us that ignoring it, uh, isn't going to make it go away. If anything, that may prolong and exacerbate the issue. So, I talked to a friend who I served with in Iraq who feels very differently than I do about Ukraine, and he said, my son's 17. I don't want him to kind of be sucked into another forever war.
Hmm.
And I made the case to him that actually supporting Ukraine is the best way not to do that,
Mhm.
because Putin has made it very clear that the Baltic, if he gets Ukraine, the Baltic states and Poland are next, and those are
Yeah.
NATO states. And then we
Yeah.
are sucked in. Then we are sucked in for real.
Hmm.
And, at least right now, if your only interest is protecting America's sons and daughters, well, Ukrainians are willing to fight. They just
Mm.
they just want our weapons and our support.
Mm. It must have been interesting for you to spend some time in Ukraine as a journalist, because when you were in Iraq, you were serving in the army, you were fighting, and you probably had some encounters with journalists covering the war. What did you learn about being a journalist from actually being on that side of the reporter's notebook, compared to when you were being covered by the journalists?
I hope I reflected the better journalist I remember from Iraq as opposed to the worst ones, right? Knowing
What's the
when to stay
difference?
out,
How would you characterize the difference between those two categories?
knowing when to stay out of the way and keep your mouth shut and just
Hmm.
observe.
Hmm.
Which I think is a good lesson for journalism, wherever you're at, but particularly a combat zone. Uh, you don't want to be a burden.
Hmm.
You've been given privileged access already, so there's a time and a place for the interviews and the rapid fire Q&A, and it's not on patrol, right? It's not on the hillside outside of Bakhmut, while you're seeing artillery be traded back and forth. Uh, keep your mouth shut, keep your eyes open, and just wait and take
Hmm.
your cues from the people who are putting themselves at additional risk by giving you access, because they
Right.
believe in you, because they in our case they believed that American media being there ultimately helps their war effort. Well, the worst thing I can do to reward that trust and faith is putting them in additional danger. So,
Yeah.
that was something I learned being on the other side of it as a lieutenant, taking different reporters out on patrol.
Mm.
Um, that said, I will admit that uh, I eventually got to the point they didn't my commanders didn't like putting media with me because I had kind of a big mouth as a soldier. So
Well, and you were
my
a blogger in those
I
days too,
was
right?
I
You had a
was
big
yeah,
pen as well.
I did. So they learned pretty quick to keep the media members away from me because I had things to say.
Well, and then I understand you were blogging, and your blog apparently had really hit nerves, or I'm sure it was powerful reading to the point where it sort of got suppressed. Or what happened to your blogging career while you were in Iraq?
It did. I mean, this was many years ago now. This would have been July 2008.
Uh-huh.
I you know I made fun of my battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel, naively thinking that it wouldn't get back to him. Of course, that's not how the internet works. I portrayed him in a very unflattering light, which to this day I will say he deserved. But it was, yeah, I was a bit of a punk lieutenant. Um, I was exhausted. We were dealing with serious matters of life and death, day in
Yeah,
and day out. It seemed like such a small, trivial thing, but they shut it. They pulled the plug on it. They shut it down. They were probably, to be honest, looking back on it, just kind of maybe they were just worried
mm,
that I was eventually going to say something about the war effort that they couldn't control, and that this
yeah,
was maybe just a good excuse for them to shut it down before it got too messy.
yeah,
Uh, but look, it was kind of a silly thing, but it did catch a lot of media attention when it happened
mm,
because there were allegations of suppressing a frontline voice and all the rest, and I appreciated the support and still do, but at the same time, I was well aware that I was part of the deal serving at the time is you're protecting rights. You don't necessarily get to abide by all of them,
yeah.
especially when you're in Iraq.
Well, and then your book Kaboom was a nonfiction book. It was sort of an extension of the blogging, more essays,
That's
and
correct.
now you've written novels about war, and you've blogged and you've done nonfiction. Do you have a sense of which has the biggest impact on helping, say, Americans decide are they for this war? What's a forever war mean? And just the important task, which I think you laid out in that interview too, how does a republic decide uh, who's gonna who we're gonna kill and why?
Mhm.
Uh, what is a novel a potentially more effective, meaningful way to help that conversation unfold than essays and nonfiction?
It's an interesting question. To change ideas and opinions about this stuff, I think there's an immediacy of the nonfiction. Uh, that said, I find writing fiction much more fulfilling. I find it
Mm,
much more challenging, and the idea, of course, is that it'll last, right? Because it's not necessarily fixed to a time and a place. That these ideas that I write about of a republic's relationship to war and peace, that's going to matter 100 years from now, long after I'm dead. I'm going to be optimistic and say the United States is still doing well to our great grandchildren, right? Those ideas will still matter. So uh, short term, I'd answer your question with nonfiction,
mm,
but long term, placing these ideas and concepts into novels and having my characters wrestle with them and engage with them and hopefully tell a compelling story in the midst of it. Yeah, that is 100% the goal.
mm.
And uh, I, I'd be lying if I said that the novels weren't really the reason I get up in the morning, because they are.
Yeah. Do you remember what you were reading when you were in Iraq? I guess there's time for reading. And did you have a Kindle? I have a podcast about Kindles, and we had a thing where we distributed 1,000 Kindles. It was called eBooks for Troops. It was in Afghanistan mainly. So I kind of pictured people sitting around reading Kindles because they couldn't. Otherwise, you'd have to read the same paperback book 5 times, I guess.
Sure.
But what was your reading experience like over there?
So Kindles, they were kind of catching on. They kind of hadn't made the jump overseas. Though I
Mm,
I had friends that served in Afghanistan a few years later, and yeah, they absolutely were reading Kindles. But uh, even in 2007, 2008, Amazon could reach us,
mm.
a testament to American empire.
You had deliveries
So,
there?
oh yeah, oh yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
it took a while to get out there, of course,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Wow.
you'd get Amazon boxes. Let's see. I remember my mom sent me Rebecca West, The Return of the Soldier.
Mm.
I read Moby Dick over there,
No.
uh, which was a very powerful read,
Mm-hmm.
and has really stuck with me ever since. I remember reading, gosh, we would read some like Tim O'Brien and
Mm-hmm.
Larry Heineman, which was, I remember like putting that down and being like, all right, this kind of sucks, but we're not dealing with tigers.
No, I'm not familiar. What's his books about? Larry Heineman.
Larry Heineman. So he wrote their Vietnam novels as well.
Okay.
He's probably best known for Paco's Story, which
Mm-hmm.
won the National Book Award.
Hmm.
Um, but I can't remember which one, but it had a tiger in it. I was like, all right,
Ah,
like scorpions aren't so bad.
tigers, no.
Yeah, so but a lot of times, let's see, I remember we would watch The Wire,
Oh,
which
yeah.
was a big show. But
Hmm.
there was like any war, there's a lot of idle time. So I got a lot of good reading done over there. And even some escapist stuff. I remember reading Richard Russo's Straight Man,
Mm,
which is like a campus novel and a very funny campus novel.
yeah.
But it was as far from my day to day over there as possible, and that was part of the reason I remember enjoying it so much.
Yeah. A story that would just keep you reading. That would be part of it. Hmm.
100%.
Well, what do you hope? I feel changed by having read Daybreak. Probably confused. I tend to think, well, I know this is quote a good war. It's to stand up to Putin and all this stuff. Had these opinions about it, but I think to actually put myself into a story that takes place there, um, it's is it a good thing that I left confused about it, or what do you hope the impact of reading the story might be on Americans of goodwill that kind of hope our country does the right thing in this situation?
I hope they just remember these are humans. These are
Hmm.
everyday people. That they're not superheroes. They're not villains. They're not monsters. With maybe the lone exception of Putin,
Hmm.
who is a megalomaniac. Um, but beyond the headlines, every an American military veteran was just killed over there a couple days ago, actually, right? And people may pause on it and read his story, and I'll be like, oh, well,
Hmm.
that however they feel about the war, they might, people who support it might feel sad for a little bit, or people who are against it might be like, oh, serves them right, whatever. Um, I wanted to go deeper than that. I wanted to show the good, bad, and ugly of both the international volunteers who are going over there, and because they believe in this so strongly. And I also wanted to show the good, bad, and ugly of Ukrainian society, because just like any other country, they have factions, and they've been through a lot of growing pains. And more than anything, they have
Hmm.
fought for this very fledgling democracy and fledgling free society, uh, uh, over and over and over again through social protests and mass movements and wars 100 years ago, and that now they're fighting on the battlefield again. So I can understand the word confusion, but more than anything, I also hope it's illuminating that
Yeah.
it's not all black and white. That
Hmm.
those messy grays of existence that I mentioned earlier are manifold through most every aspect of this country, society, and its war for self determination.
Hmm. I've been speaking with Matt Gallagher, author of Daybreak, his novel that will be released on February 20th by Atria Books, an imprint of Simon and Schuster. It's also available for pre-order, I might say. So, well, now she said I have to wait till the 20th to put this up, so I can't help you with the pre-orders, but I hope there are a lot of them and that it's a great book. Will really wish you well with it.
Oh, thanks so much, Len. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you couldn't hear my dog in the background.
No, I didn't hear the dog.
Okay,
That would have
good,
added
good.
something. I may have to add a dog. That would be good.
He had plenty to say, so I'm glad these headphones worked.
Okay. Take care. Thanks a lot, Matt.
You too.